John woke up promptly at 6 in the morning, as he always did, when the alarm on his old iPhone, which he hadn't yet upgraded to because, why waste money on something that already works, made a familiar crackling sound that reminded him of when he was still in college and trying to survive on a scholarship by skimping on everything but coffee and pizza. He stretched, feeling the muscles in his back protesting slightly from the previous evening spent watching another season of The Crown on Netflix, where he and Emma had argued about how historically accurate all this royal intrigue was, and she, as always, had defended the point of view that TV shows weren't documentaries, they were just a way to unwind after a long day. Outside their modest Belltown apartment, Seattle was already waking up under a gray blanket of clouds that never seemed to clear completely, only occasionally letting in a timid ray of sunshine to remind residents that somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, real summer existed. But here, in this city of rain and coffee shops, everyday life was saturated with moisture and the aroma of freshly brewed espresso, which beckoned John to crawl out from under the warm blanket, put on his beat-up Six sneakers, bought 3 years ago on sale at Ray, and go for a morning run along streets where the asphalt was always shiny from a recent rainstorm and passers-by hurried under umbrellas, muttering something about typical Seattle weather. He stood up, quietly, so as not to wake Emma, who was asleep on her side of the bed, curled up under the sheets, her brown hair spread out across the pillow, and John thought in that moment how lucky he had been 8 years ago when they had met at that company party at the small software company where he was interning and she was working in marketing, and their conversation had started with a joke about how absurd those team-building exercises like falling backwards with your eyes closed were, and since then their life had flowed as smoothly as the Puget Sound, with occasional blips like their wedding in a small park near Lake Union and the purchase of this apartment, which they had furnished together, choosing furniture from IKEA and arguing over the color of the couch. He wanted gray, she insisted on beige, eventually settling on a compromise that now sat in the living room, covered with the throw blanket her mother had given them for their anniversary. John put on sweatpants and a windbreaker that kept out the wind but not the rain in Seattle. You just get used to being wet, and stepped outside, where the air was crisp, salty from the nearby ocean and fumes from passing cars, and the sidewalks were already filled with early risers. DoorDash delivery bike riders, office workers with backpacks full of laptops, and homeless people huddled in old jackets at subway entrances, reminders that beneath the veneer of Seattle's tech boom, there was a layer of social reality that John occasionally noticed but chose not to delve into, focusing on his own world. The run began with a light warm-up outside their apartment building, a 70s modernist building with concrete walls and large windows overlooking the downtown skyscrapers, and John ran toward the waterfront, where the Puget Sound waves lapped the piers and the ferries to the islands honked low and long, as if welcoming a new day. He ran at his usual pace, not so fast that he'd be exhausted before work, but hard enough that he'd feel a rush of adrenaline that helped him get through the day at the office, where he worked as an engineer at a small tech company called Cascade Tech Solutions, building software to automate business processes, nothing revolutionary like Google or Amazon, but a steady 9-to-5 job with health insurance and the ability to work remotely a couple of days a week, which allowed him to sometimes stay home and cook dinner for Emma, experimenting with recipes he'd found on YouTube, like Thai curry or Italian pasta, though more often than not they'd order pizza from the local Domino's, because after a long day there wasn't much energy left for culinary exploits. The rain was a fine spray, dampening his hair and running down his face, but John loved the feeling it reminded him of his childhood in Oregon, where he grew up in a small town along the coast, running along the beaches with his father, who was a fisherman and taught him to appreciate the simple pleasures of life, like fresh air and the quiet of the early morning, before his father passed away 5 years ago from lung cancer, leaving John with memories and an old fishing rod that now gathered dust in the garage. Along the way, he passed a park overlooking the Space Needle, that Seattle icon that towered over the city like a reminder of the 1962 World's Fair, and thought about how he and Emma had once climbed to the top of it on their first anniversary, eating dinner in the revolving restaurant and looking out at the city lights, promising each other that their lives would be just as bright and adventurous. But over the years, the adventures had given way to comfort. Weekend trips to the Cascade Mountains, where they'd hike the trails and roast marshmallows around a campfire, or just lazy Sundays in bed with a book, he reading techno thrillers like Dan Brown, she preferring Jane Austen, joking that it balanced their tastes. His run took him to Pike Place Market, that chaotic heart of Seattle where even in the early morning there were already vendors bustling about, setting out crates of fresh seafood, flowers, and fruit, and the air was filled with cries of flying fish from the fishmongers, where guys in aprons tossed salmon over the counter, entertaining tourists, though at this time of day there were few tourists, only locals like John, going about their daily ritual. He stopped at the Harbor Brew, a small place near the market with wooden tables and a view of the bay, where the barista, Mike, a guy with tattoos on his arms and a pierced nose, already knew his order. A double Americano with milk, no sugar, because John was watching his figure, although he did allow himself the occasional donut from the bakery next door, especially on days when he was in a bad mood, like after a fight with Emma over something as trivial as who had washed the dishes last. Sitting at a table by the window, John sipped his coffee, looking out at the rain, which had gotten heavier, pattering against the glass, and thought about work. Today, he had to refine the code for a new module that optimized data processing for retail clients. Nothing exciting, but it brought in a steady income that allowed him to plan a vacation he and Emma had long dreamed of: Hawaii, of the white beaches of Maui, where they could scuba dive and drink cocktails by the pool, forgetting about the Seattle cold. He imagined them lying on the sand, holding hands, and Emma telling him about her ideas for a new marketing campaign at her company, where she worked as a project manager, often staying late because of important deadlines. As she said, especially in recent months, when her boss Richard, a charismatic guy with an MBA from Stanford, assigned her more and more tasks related to international partners. John smiled to himself, remembering how last night, when Emma had come home at 9, looking tired but with a sparkle in her eye, he had joked, "Staying up with Richard again. I hope he doesn't take my wife out on romantic dinners under the guise of discussing strategy." And she had laughed, hugging him and saying, "You know you're the one and only, and Richard's just the boss, albeit a demanding one." But there had been something in her voice that John hadn't caught, or hadn't wanted to catch, preferring to believe that their marriage was as strong as those rocks on the coast that could withstand storms. Back home from his run, wet and refreshed, John took a shower in their small bathroom, where the tiles were slightly cracked with age, but they were in no hurry to fix them. Why, if everything works, and went out to the kitchen, where Emma was already making coffee for herself, standing in her favorite cat print pajamas that he had bought her for her birthday 2 years ago, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, making her look like the girl he had fallen in love with once. "Morning, runner," she said, kissing his cheek, and John smelled the familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with the smell of sleep that always calmed him. They sat down at the table, eating oatmeal with fruit, their standard breakfast, healthy and boring, but practical, and chatted about their plans for the day. He told her about an upcoming meeting with the team, where they had to discuss bugs in the latest release. She mentioned that she would be late again today because Richard wanted to rework the presentation for investors, and John nodded without going into details, although somewhere deep down he noted that such delays had become the norm, almost weekly, and jokes about Richard, this 40-year-old careerist with a perfect haircut and Hugo Boss suits, began to seem a little less funny to him, but he pushed the thought away, focusing on discussing the vacation. "Imagine, John, we're in Hawaii, swimming in the ocean, eating fresh poke, and no rain, just sun and palm trees," Emma said dreamily, stirring her coffee, her eyes lighting up like they had when they first started dating and planned weekend trips to Portland or Vancouver, where they'd walk the streets holding hands and open new cafes. John smiled, taking her hand. "Yes, honey, I'm already looking at the tickets. Maybe in November, when it gets really gray here, we can go for 2 weeks, rent a bungalow by the beach, and forget about work." And they continued to fantasize about going surfing, which neither of them had ever done, or just lying in a hammock reading books and drinking Kona beers. But at that moment her phone rang, and the name Richard appeared on the screen, which made John frown for a second, but he quickly hid it behind a joke. "Oh, your knight in shining armor calling for adventures? Tell him your princess is already taken." And Emma laughed, answering the phone and moving away, saying something about, "Yes, I'll look at the file right now," and "meet me in the office in an hour." And John sat there finishing his tea and thinking that it's probably paranoia, because Emma has always been devoted, loyal, and their life is not some kind of dramatic series, but a reality where people just work hard to build the future. The day at the office was typical. John took the bus because parking downtown was expensive and walked into the Cascade Tech Building, a modest five-story office overlooking the street, where his colleagues were already seated at desks covered with monitors and coffee mugs. His boss, Bob, an older man with a graying beard and a love of golf, held a morning stand-up meeting in which everyone reported on their progress, and John talked about his module, receiving nods of approval from his team Sarah, a young developer fresh out of college, and Michael, a 20-year veteran who always joked about the good old days of BASIC. He spent lunch in the cafeteria, eating a tuna sandwich and reading the news on his phone. Something about new sanctions against China affecting the tech industry, and local events like the opening of a new farmers market in Capitol Hill that he and Emma might go to over the weekend. And afternoons, coding, debugging, testing, all the things that made his work predictable but satisfying, because at the end of the day he saw the result: software that helped companies work more efficiently and that gave him a sense of making an impact on the world, however small. By the time John got home around 6 that evening, the apartment was empty. Emma had texted him that she was staying until 8. The project with Richard is on hold, and he sighed, but decided not to be upset and instead made dinner. Pasta carbonara, an online recipe, with bacon, eggs, and Parmesan cheese he'd bought at Whole Foods last week. While the water was boiling, he turned on a tech podcast, listening to experts discuss AI and its impact on the workplace, and thought that their company didn't have anything revolutionary yet. But who knows, maybe one day he'll move to a big tech giant like Amazon, where Emma sometimes hinted that she might get a job, thanks to Richard's connections, who, according to her, knew everyone in the industry. When Emma finally returned, with a bag over her shoulder and a tired smile, the aroma of pasta had already filled the apartment, and she hugged him from behind. "My chef, you saved the day," and they sat at the table, eating, chatting about small things, about the funny story Sarah told about her cat in the office, or how Emma won a bet with a colleague about the best coffee in town. But then the conversation turned to work, and Emma brightened up as she talked about the project. "Richard is so inspiring, John. He sees things 3 steps ahead. Today we reworked the entire strategy for the Asian market, and this could be a breakthrough for the company." And John nodded, but inside he felt a prick, not jealousy, no, more curiosity about why her eyes sparkled so much when she talked about the boss and not about him. He joked, "It sounds like Richard is a superhero. Maybe I should worry about him stealing my marketing star." And Emma rolled her eyes, laughing. "Oh, come on, you know I only love you, and Richard is, well, he's just a boss, albeit a cool one." But there was something noncommittal in her tone, or so he imagined, and they moved on to Netflix, picking up an episode of Stranger Things, snuggling together on the couch, and John thought that their life was a comfortable routine, with the little cracks that probably every marriage has, and it was okay because tomorrow was a new day, with a run and coffee and plans to Hawaii. After the show, they went to bed and Emma fell asleep quickly, and John lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain outside the window, and thought about how everything had changed in 8 years. From passionate nights and spontaneous trips to this stability that was nice but sometimes boring, and he wondered if he was missing something. But he pushed the thought away, kissing Emma's shoulder and falling asleep to the sounds of the city. The next morning started the same way. Alarm, run, coffee at Harbor Brew, where Mike asked, "Double again." "You're like a machine, man." And John laughed and said, "Habit is second nature." But inside he felt that nature was starting to weigh him down a little, especially when Emma mentioned Richard again at breakfast, talking about an upcoming conference they were going to together, a business trip, nothing personal, and John nodded. But the joke about romantic projects caught in his throat, not coming out, because he didn't want to seem paranoid. The days blurred into weeks, runs in the rain, where John would occasionally pass familiar runners and nod, office routines of code and meetings, evenings with Emma when she would come home later and later with stories about work, and their conversations about Hawaii would become more detailed. They would look at hotel photos on booking.com, choose volcano excursions, and John would book tickets, feeling excited about the upcoming vacation. But cracks were beginning to appear. One day, Emma would forget about their dinner at a favorite Italian restaurant, apologizing. Richard was late, urgent call from Tokyo, and John would forgive her, but he would notice how she checked her phone more often, smiling at messages that she said were from the team. He would joke, "Your boss is a real attention magnet," and she would wave it off, but there was a tension in the air, subtle as fog over the bay, but palpable. One night, after a particularly long day, when Emma came home at 10, smelling of wine, a corporate dinner with clients, they lay down and John held her, whispering, "I love our life, Em, even with these delays," and she said, "So do I, honey," but her voice was distracted, and he didn't know that the joke about Richard would soon cease to be a joke, becoming a reality that would turn their Seattle routine upside down. John stood at the kitchen window, watching the rain run down the glass, turning the view of the street into a blur, where cars sped past like shadows in the fog, and he thought that Seattle had always been like this, a city where reality blurred under a layer of moisture, making everything a little less clear, a little more mysterious, and it was at a moment like this, as he made coffee for the two of them in their cozy, but already slightly shabby apartment, that he noticed Emma, sitting at the table with her phone in her hands, quickly swiping away a notification, her fingers flashing across the screen with the haste you use when you want to hide something that is not intended for strangers to see. And although she smiled at him, looking up and saying, "Morning, honey, they're forecasting sunshine this afternoon. Maybe we should go for a walk in the park." John felt a slight prick in his chest, like a needle had been stuck unnoticed but deep enough to leave a mark, because it wasn't the first time in recent weeks. Her phone had become like a living thing, beeping at unexpected moments, and each time she responded in the same way. A quick glance, a swipe, and then an innocent smile that had seemed sincere to him before, but now raised questions that hung in the air like the smoke from his cigarette, which he sometimes smoked on the balcony in the evenings when Emma was already asleep, wondering why their life, which had seemed so stable, had suddenly begun to creak like old floorboards underfoot. He poured coffee into their favorite mugs, his with the words, "Best engineer ever," written on it, a birthday present from their colleagues, and hers with the Eiffel Tower on it, a reminder of that trip to Paris 5 years ago, when they were newly married and everything had seemed so adventurous, and sat down across from her, handing her the mug and saying, "That sounds great, Em. It's been a while since we've had a chance to just hang out without plans. Remember how in college we could just run off to the lake or the mountains at any moment?" And she nodded, taking a sip of her coffee, but her eyes slid back to her phone, face down, on the table, and John couldn't help but ask, half jokingly, "Who's texting so early? Is it Richard again with his ideas for world domination?" And she laughed, but it came out a little taut, like the guitar strings he sometimes picked up in the evenings, strumming old tunes from their college days, and she said, "Oh, no, just a friend, Sarah, inviting her over for a girls' night out on Friday, nothing special, the girls from the office looking to unwind after a hard week." And John raised an eyebrow because Sarah was a new name. He'd never heard of her before, although Emma had occasionally mentioned co-workers, but always people he knew, like Lisa or Mark, and now this Sarah had come out of nowhere, like the girls' nights that had started happening once a week, where Emma would come home late, smelling faintly of wine and telling stories of funny conversations, but without the details that would make it real for him, and he wondered if it was just paranoia, because in marriage people changed, made new friends, but something inside him was whispering, "What if not?" As they ate breakfast avocado toast, which Emma liked to make from a recipe on Pinterest, with chili peppers for a kick. John remembered how they'd met at the University of Washington, on that sprawling campus in Seattle where autumn leaves carpeted the paths, and he, a quiet kid from a working-class family in a small town in Oregon, where his father had worked in a lumber mill all his life and his mother had sewn clothes from home to make ends meet, had felt out of place among these bright, rich students with their new laptops and their plans for internships in Silicon Valley. He studied engineering, sitting for hours in the library poring over schematics and code, preferring silence to noisy parties, and then one day, in a marketing lecture, he'd taken it as an elective. To broaden his horizons, she walked into the room, Emma, with a shock of brown hair and a bright sweater and a smile that lit up the room, like she was born for the stage and not for boring slides about consumer behavior. And when the professor asked them to pair up for a project, she turned to him, who was sitting in the back row, and said, "Hey, you look like the kind of guy who knows how to make a presentation not boring. Let's do it together." And John, blushing under her gaze, nodded, not believing his luck, because Emma was from another world, the daughter of a lawyer and a teacher from the Seattle suburbs, raised on trips to Europe and tennis lessons, always hungry for adventure, whether it was a spontaneous hike in Mount Rainier or an all-night talking about dreams under the stars on the roof of the dorm. They started working on a project analyzing Starbucks's marketing strategy. Ironic given how much coffee they'd drunk in those weeks, and John discovered that beneath her brightness was a sharp mind, able to generate ideas on the fly, while he provided the structure, the math, the logic and consistency, and their conversations moved from business to personal. She would tell stories of her travels to Italy, where she'd eaten pasta in little trattorias and dreamed of a life of adventure, and he would share stories of fishing with his father in the Pacific, where silence was more valuable than words, and it created a contrast that drew them together, her thirst for novelty and his love of stability, like yin and yang, complementing each other, and soon the project was over. But they continued to meet, walking around campus, kissing in the rain by the fountain, and John thought he'd found someone who would brighten his life without changing who he was. But Emma whispered to him, "You're so real, John. In this world of fake smiles, you're like an anchor that keeps me in place." And they fell in love, planning a future where her adventures would be balanced by his reliability. But now, sitting at breakfast, John wondered if that sense of adventure had always been a ticking time bomb, because Emma had seemed restless in recent months, as if their routine, which he prized for its predictability, had become a cage for her, and that new perfume he'd noticed a couple of weeks ago, not her usual light citrusy bath and bodywork scent, but something more intense, musky, with notes of sandalwood, which she'd explained as just trying something new at Sephora, wanted a change. But John had caught the scent of it on her clothes even after the girls' nights, and it made him wonder where it had come from, especially when she quickly erased messages as if they were clues in some detective novel he read in the evenings to escape. After breakfast, he kissed her goodbye, feeling her lips respond, but with a slight detachment, and left for work. But on the way to the bus, he couldn't help but think, what if Richard is not just a boss, but the one who gives her the adventures she always craved? At the office, the day dragged on as usual. Code, meetings where Bob praised him for the timely delivery of the module, and lunch with Sarah, who chatted about her new boyfriend, making John smile and think about his own relationship. But inside, suspicions whispered like the wind in the leaves outside the window, and when he came home early, deciding to surprise her and cook her favorite steak with vegetables, he found the apartment empty, and on the table a note. "Late at work, don't wait up, I love you." And her phone was lying on the charger, a rarity, because she always took it with her, and John, struggling with himself, still picked it up, entering the PIN code he knew, because they had no secrets, or so he thought, and opened the messages, but found nothing suspicious, only the usual chats with his mother, with him, with Lisa, but the deleted ones were empty, although he knew that the iPhone stores recently deleted ones, and something flashed there. A fragment from unknown number. "I can't wait to see you tonight. It's going to be unforgettable." But before he could read the rest, he heard the key in the lock. Emma had returned early, and he quickly put the phone back, his heart pounding as if he had just run downhill. "Hi, honey, you're early today," she said, coming in with bags from the store, and John smiled, hiding his excitement. "Yeah, decided to make dinner, like old times." And they cooked together, chatting about small things, but when she went to take a shower, he noticed how she took her phone with her, which she hadn't done before, and it added fuel to the suspicions that now burned quietly but steadily, making him remember their college days more deeply. How Emma had always been the center of attention at parties, dancing to the music in the frat bar where he'd sat in the corner watching her with a smile. And sometimes she'd go off with her friends on slumber parties back then too, but she'd always come back to him, telling him everything in detail. And now these new friends, Sarah, Kate, whom he'd never met, appeared in her stories like ghosts, without photos, without invitations to share dinners, and he wondered if her thirst for adventure, which had once brought her to me, now takes her away. The evening was spent watching Netflix, but John couldn't focus on the show. His mind was wandering, and when Emma snuggled up to him, smelling of that new perfume, he took a deep breath, trying to catch the scent of something foreign, something masculine, and he said, tell me about Sarah. Who is she? Maybe you could invite me to your get-togethers sometime. And she hesitated for a second, then said, oh, she's new in the office, a marketer like me. We just talk about work and life. Nothing that interests you, honey. It's girly stuff, shopping, gossip. And John nodded, but inside the whisper of suspicion grew louder. What if it's not girly stuff, it's something more? And he remembered Emma once confessing to him in college after an argument. Sometimes I feel like I'm missing out on life, John. You're so stable, and I want to fly. And he had replied, we will fly together. But now he wondered if she had found someone who gave her those wings, like Richard, with his travels and charisma. The next day, the suspicions snowballed. While jogging, John saw Emma get a text message, and her face lit up with a smile he hadn't seen in a long time, not the warm one that was for him, but the playful one of their early days, and when he returned, she had already gone to work, leaving the bed unmade, which was not her style, and on the bedside table was a bottle of that new perfume, Guilty by Gucci, and the name seemed ironic to him, like a hint from fate. At the office he couldn't concentrate, the code was jumbled, and during lunch with Michael he shared vaguely, you know, sometimes it seems like in a marriage everything changes, people grow apart, and Michael, munching on a sandwich, replied, yeah man, my ex started with working late and ended up with a lawyer, but you and Emma are a strong couple, don't get yourself worked up. But this only increased doubts, and in the evening, when Emma announced another bachelorette party, John offered, maybe I'll give you a ride, meet your friends. And she refused. No need, honey, we're meeting at a bar downtown, you'll be tired after work, you better rest. And left, leaving him alone with thoughts that swirled like leaves in the autumn wind. He stayed up that night, waiting for her to come back at 2 o'clock, and when she came in, quietly, so as not to wake him, but he was awake, and he caught a scent not just of wine, but of that perfume mixed with something masculine, like cologne, and the next morning, when she was asleep, he checked her bag ashamed of himself, but unable to stop himself, and found a receipt from the bar, but for two, with cocktails that she did not drink, and that was the last straw. The whisper of suspicion turned to a roar, and he realized that the contrast of their worlds, his roots in simplicity, hers in the thirst for novelty, might have led to a crack that was about to break everything. Emma walked into the offices of the marketing firm Harper Dynamics, located in a glass skyscraper in downtown Seattle, where the elevators glided silently upward, as if to underscore the sleekness of the corporate life she had chosen years ago, when she was still in college and dreamed of the dynamics of big campaigns, of how words and images could change the world, or at least sell products with glamour and style. And now, as she walked down the carpeted hallway, the click of her heels, the same black Zara pumps she had put on today to feel more confident, she felt the familiar rush of adrenaline mixed with the quiet anxiety that had settled inside her in recent months, like an uninvited guest who comes in the evenings and whispers about choice, about the balance between what is right and what excites, making her heart beat faster than the morning espresso in the ground floor cafe where she had taken her latte with almond milk, because the regular cow's milk now seemed too bland, like so much of her life with John, this reliable but predictable man who waited for her at home with dinner and vacation plans, unaware that her days at the office had long since ceased to be just work. She passed an open-plan space where young colleagues, designers in hoodies and marketers with tablets were tapping away at keyboards, discussing the latest social media trends, like TikTok viruses or Instagram reels that could explode sales for their e-commerce clients. And Emma smiled at Lisa, her friend in the department, who waved at her and called, "Hey, celebrity, coffee after lunch," and she nodded, although inside she thought that Lisa, with her stable marriage and 2 kids, probably wouldn't understand why Emma had recently been choosing girls' nights with fictional Sarah and Kate, who were actually cover for dates with Richard, this man who had come into her life like a storm over Puget Sound, promising not only career advancement, but also the excitement she had been craving after 8 years of a routine in which Netflix nights and discussions about the electric bill had replaced the spontaneous adventures they'd had in college, when she and John would sneak off to a lake motel for the night just to feel alive. But now John was like an anchor holding her in place, and she wanted to swim, even into dangerous waters. When she got to her cubicle, a modest space with a monitor covered in campaign idea post-its and a photo of John in front of the Space Needle that now made her feel guilty every time she looked at it, Emma sat down at her desk, turned on her computer, and opened her email, where the first message was from Richard. "Good morning, Emma. Come to my office at 10 to discuss the project with the Asian partners. And by the way, you looked amazing last night." And she felt her cheeks heat up, remembering the company dinner last night, which had really been a date at a small Italian restaurant in Belltown, where they'd drunk Chianti and eaten ossobuco and talked not just about work, but about life, about how Richard had gotten divorced 2 years ago, tired of the boring stability, and how he saw potential in her for more, for a vice president position if she was willing to invest the extra hours, which was their code word for those moments when they stayed in the office past 6, closing the door to his office and letting the flirting turn to kissing, and then further on his leather couch, where the scent of his cologne, the same musky, sandalwood-tinged one she now wore to remind herself of that feeling, mingled with her perfume to create a scent of the forbidden that was both arousing and terrifying. She responded quickly, "I'll be there at 10. Thanks for yesterday, it was productive," adding an emoji that might have been innocent to onlookers but meant so much more to them. And then she got to work, analyzing data from a recent campaign for a fashion client to calculate the ROI of influencer marketing. And as the numbers flashed on the screen, Emma thought about her double life, about how it all started 6 months ago at that conference in San Francisco where they'd gone together. And after a panel on digital marketing, Richard had suggested a drink at the hotel bar, where the talk of strategy had turned to compliments. "You're not just talented, Emma. You light up a room like no one else." And she, tired of the routine with John, where sex had become as rare and predictable as their dinners, had allowed herself to respond to his flirtations, and then to his kiss in the elevator, feeling guilty but also an adrenaline rush that reminded her of that girl in college who loved risk, who went skydiving on her birthday and dreamed of a life of passion, not a stable marriage, where John, that sweet but quiet working-class guy, offered security but not fire. And now, justifying herself, she thought, "This isn't a betrayal. It's just a way to keep from going crazy with boredom. John won't notice anyway, and I'll be a better person for both of us," with the new energy of moving on. At 10 o'clock, she knocked on the door of Richard's office, a luxurious space on the corner of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay where yachts bobbed and the Space Needle loomed like a reminder of dreams, and everything inside was minimalist. A large oak desk piled high with folders and MacBooks, a leather sofa against the wall where they spent many an extra hour, and shelves filled with business books, The Lean Startup and Good to Great, which Richard quoted like mantras, emphasizing his ambition, because at 42 he had already founded a company, divorced a wife who didn't understand his drive, and now lived in a penthouse in South Lake Union, overlooking the Amazon spheres that symbolized the success that Emma also wanted. But with John it seemed unattainable, because he preferred the stability of a small tech company to the risks of big business. "Come in, Emma. It's good to see you," Richard said, standing up from the table. His smile was that confident one, with the slight crinkle of his eyes that accentuated his laugh lines, and he was dressed in a perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit, the top button of his shirt undone to reveal his tan skin from a recent trip to Mexico where he'd gone on an inspirational retreat, and she walked in, closing the door, feeling the air in the room charged with electricity, the way it always did when they were alone. He came closer without sitting down right away and touched her hand. "You look amazing today, that perfume. It drives me crazy, just like you do." And Emma smiled, moving towards the table to keep her distance, because in the office you had to be careful, although rumors were already circulating. Lisa hinted a couple of times, but she laughed it off and said, "Thank you, Richard, but let's get down to business. A project with Asian partners, we need to finalize the presentation, add engagement data to WeChat," trying to steer the conversation into a professional direction, but he did not let up, sitting opposite and leaning forward. "Of course, but you know that I value not only your mind, Emma. You are the key to the success of this firm, and if you are ready for extra hours, I can offer you a senior manager position, with bonuses and travel. Imagine, we are in Tokyo, discussing deals during the day and enjoying ourselves at night." His words hung in the air like the smoke from the cigarette he sometimes smoked on the balcony after meetings, and Emma felt a familiar thrill, a mixture of excitement and guilt, because Richard was offering not only sex but a world where she could shine, not just be an engineer's wife, but a woman with a career, with travel, where every day was an adventure, unlike at home, where John waited with pasta and questions about his day, unaware that her delays were moments when she felt alive. But then, lying next to him at night, she would torment herself with, "What am I doing? John loves me, he deserves better, but this boredom, it's suffocating like Seattle fog, and Richard is a breath of fresh air, even with the risk of a storm." She replied, trying to sound professional, "That sounds great, Richard, but let's focus on the presentation. I've prepared some analytics slides." And they moved on to work, discussing charts and strategies, but his foot under the table touched hers, and it wasn't by accident, making her heart speed up, and during the break he stood up, coming closer. "Emma, seriously, you deserve more than routine. I see you coming alive here with me. Why not indulge in it completely?" And she sighed, looking out the window at the rain that had started to drizzle, blurring the view. "Because I have a life outside the office, Richard, a husband, plans. It's complicated." But he took her hand. "I know, but life is short, and if it makes you happy, isn't it worth the risk? After work today, my penthouse, champagne, and no commitments, just a balance between work and pleasure." She nodded her head, agreeing because it was hard to refuse his charisma, his promises. All of it filled the void she felt with John, where their conversations became superficial, about the weather and bills, and not about dreams like before, and the whole day at the office was spent in this balance. Meetings with the team, where she sparkled with ideas, lunch with Lisa, who asked, "Are you okay? I seem absent-minded." And Emma answered, "Just a lot of work, but everything is cool." Hiding the truth, and inside she was struggling with the conflict. Guilt burned when she thought about John, running in the morning, planning Hawaii, but the excuse came quickly. "He does not understand my thirst. He is satisfied with little, and I want more. This does not make me bad, just human." And in the evening, leaving with Richard under the pretext of extra hours, she felt the balance tilting, but not towards home, but towards this new, a dangerous reality where she was not just a wife, but a woman with secrets, complex, full of contradictions, and this made life interesting, even if it was on the edge of the abyss. After the meeting in his penthouse with a view of the city, champagne, and a bed where they whispered about the future, Emma rode home in a taxi, looking at the lights of Seattle, and tears came to her eyes. "What have I done? John deserves the truth, but how can I tell him when it will ruin everything?" But then she wiped away the tears, applied lipstick, and walked into the apartment with a smile. "Hi, honey, sorry for the delay. The project was crazy." And John hugged her, not noticing the smell of someone else's cologne under her perfume, and she thought that this balance is fragile, like the glass of a skyscraper, but for now it holds, giving her strength for tomorrow. In the office the next day, it was all over again. Richard's flirtation over coffee in the break room. "You're irresistible, Emma. Let's do it again yesterday," and her answer, "Not here, people are watching." but with a smile that encouraged, and during a presentation to clients, she felt his gaze full of promise, and in the evening another bachelorette party, in fact dinner with him in a restaurant overlooking the ocean, where they talked about a trip to Asia. Take me with you as a business partner. And not only, and she laughed, forgetting about the wine for an hour, but at home, lying down next to John, she thought, this is not villainy. This is a search for myself. John is my foundation. Richard is a spark. Maybe I can combine without breaking anything. But deep inside she knew that the balance was about to be disturbed, and it was frightening, but also beckoning, like the lights of the city outside the window. The days at the office became a whirlwind. Meetings where Richard praised her publicly, Emma, your ideas are gold, and private moments in his office where kisses turned passionate, and she justified herself. The marriage has become routine. John is not changing, and I am evolving, feeling not like a monster, but like a woman in crisis, with an internal battle where her love for John fought with her attraction to Richard, and this made her days full of drama, like the TV series they watched together, unaware that her life had become like a plot. Emma sat in the corner of the trendy Iron Anchor pub, tucked away in the maze of narrow streets of Capitol Hill, where the neon signs reflected in the puddles left by one of Seattle's rainstorms, creating the illusion that the city was floating in liquid light. And she sipped her gin and tonic, watching Mike, the bartender with tattoos covering his forearms like a map of their shared past, deftly mix drinks behind the bar, his movements polished, almost theatrical, and every time he glanced at her, there was that same genuine warmth in his eyes that reminded her of their high school days in suburban Seattle, when she and Mike, then an awkward teenager with long hair and dreams of a rock band, would sit on the roof of his house, smoking cigarettes they'd stolen from his parents, and talking about how they'd escape this boring, small town to New York or Los Angeles to live a real life, full of music and freedom. Now, 15 years later, Mike was no longer a rock star, but his charm, enhanced by years of working in bars, where he learned to read people like an open book, made him a magnet for those evenings when Emma, tired of the stress of her double life with Richard and John, was looking for something simple, familiar, like an old sweater that you put on to feel at home, and their meetings, which began accidentally 3 months ago, when she went to the Iron Anchor after work to have a drink with her girlfriends, turned into a ritual where nostalgia mixed with light flirtation, and sometimes with kisses in a dark corner of the place, when the pub emptied and Mike closed the bar, leaving them alone with the sounds of an old playlist with Nirvana and Pearl Jam. She looked at her watch 9:30. John thought she was at another bachelorette party, and this lie, so familiar that it no longer caused a burning in her chest, allowed her to sit here in this semi-darkness, where the light from the candles on the table reflected in her eyes, and listen to Mike, having finished mixing another cocktail for a noisy company in the corner, come up to her, wiping his hands on a towel, and said with the same crooked smile that had not changed since school, you seem kind of thoughtful today. Is your boss brainwashing you with his corporate fairy tales again? And she laughed, taking a sip, feeling the gin softly enveloping her throat, and answered, you always knew how to figure me out, Mike, but no, it's just life, sometimes you want to go back to those times when everything was simpler, without deadlines, without. She hesitated, not wanting to say, without a husband, but Mike, catching her pause, leaning closer, his hands on the counter, no strings attached, huh? I remember how we used to dream of running away. You wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to be Kurt Cobain, and now here I am pouring drinks, and you're building a career in an office. But, you're still the same Emma who loved adventure. And his words, so simple but so precise, touched something in her, made her remember that night a month ago when they were alone after the pub closed and he put on Where Did You Sleep Last Night on the old record player, and they danced, slowly, pressed together, and then they kissed, and it wasn't passionate, like with Richard, but something warm, like a memory you want to hold on to, but know is slipping away. Meanwhile, John, sitting in their apartment in Belltown, scrolling through his laptop, trying to distract himself from the emptiness of the house, where the TV was quietly blaring news about a new startup in Seattle, and there was a half-eaten pizza on the table, ordered from his usual Domino's, because there was no point in cooking for one, and his gaze fell on his inbox, where among the spam offers for loans and discounts on mattresses flashed a strange email with no name on the sender, with the subject, "You should know," and he opened it, more out of curiosity than alarm, thinking it was another phishing scam, but the text read, "Your wife is not where she says she is. Check her PM. This is not a joke," and John frowned, feeling his heart squeeze a little, but then closed the email, sending it to the trash, muttering to himself, "What nonsense, spam, who writes things like that?" Because to believe it was to admit that his world, such stable as the code he writes, can crumble, and he chose to turn on Netflix, choosing an old episode of The Office to drown out the whisper that still crept into his mind. What if this is true? Emma, meanwhile, was no longer in the pub, but in Mike's car, parked in a dark alley nearby, where they'd kissed like teenagers while the radio played something from the 90s, and she felt nostalgia turning into desire, not like with Richard, where it was all about power and ambition, but something soft, like she was returning to her old self, and Mike had whispered, you know I'm always here if you need to run away, like that time at school." And she'd nodded but pulled away, adjusting her hair. "I need to go home, Mike. John's waiting." And he hadn't insisted. He just walked her to the taxi, and she'd been driving home, looking at the lights of the city, thinking that Mike was her past, which she didn't want to let go of, but which couldn't become her future because Richard was already there. And most importantly, John, and the thought had made her clutch her phone, where there was an unread message from Trevor, her fitness trainer, the third man who had entered her life 3 weeks ago, like a hurricane of physical passion. No words, no promises, just bodies and movement. Trevor was different, not part of her past, like Mike, or her ambitious present, like Richard, but the pure embodiment of a desire she had discovered in herself at peak pulse, where she had joined 6 months earlier to keep in shape, but really to escape her routine, and Trevor, with his sculpted muscles and tan skin and a smile that promised nothing but the moment, had noticed her at their first class as she huffed and puffed on the treadmill, trying to keep up with his pace, and after the workout he had come up to her and said, "Emma, you're strong, but I can make you stronger. Do you want a personalized program?" And that had been the beginning. First the workouts, then the coffee after them, and then, 2 weeks ago, the moment in the locker room after everyone had left, and he had pinned her against the wall and whispered, "You know what you want, just take it." And she had taken it, letting herself drown in the physical, with no emotion, no talk of the future, just sweat and breathing and the feeling that she was alive, not just a wife or a manager, but a woman whose body responded to his every touch. And from then on, their meetings once a week, after training, in his apartment near the gym became her way of letting off steam, without thinking about the consequences, because Trevor asked for nothing more than her presence. And it was simple, unlike Richard with his career promises or Mike with his nostalgia. A flashback of that first night with Trevor came back to her in a cab. His apartment, minimalist, with weights in the corner and the smell of protein shakes, where they didn't talk, just moved, and she felt free like she had in college, jumping off the pier into the lake without thinking about the cold of the water. And then she'd left without leaving a number, but he'd texted her the next day. When again, and she'd texted back because it was easy, without the guilt that had plagued her with Richard or the warmth that had connected her with Mike, just physical, like a workout but deeper. And now, looking at his text, today after the gym, she'd texted back, "Not today, busy today," because Mike had already taken her evening and Richard had taken her morning, and somewhere out there was John, whom she loved but who seemed further away, like a shore she was sailing away from. She walked in quietly, thinking John was asleep, but he was sitting on the couch with his laptop, and he looked at her with a smile, but there was something in his eyes that she didn't notice. "It's late today. Was the girls' night out a success?" And she nodded, kissing him on the cheek. "Yes, the girls have left, but I'm tired. I'm going to take a shower." And in the bathroom, washing away Mike's scent, she thought that her life was a dance in the shadows, where each man gave her something that the other lacked. Richard ambition, Mike the past, Trevor passion, and John a home. But this home was starting to crack, and she didn't know how long she could balance before everything collapsed. Meanwhile, John, with his laptop closed, lay in bed, listening to the sound of the water coming from the bathroom, and remembered the letter that he had discarded as spam. But now it was spinning in his head like an annoying melody, and he thought, this is nonsense. Emma is not like that. We have been together for 8 years. It's just fatigue, work. But somewhere inside the whisper of suspicion that began with her delays, new perfumes and evasive answers became louder, and he decided that tomorrow he would check her phone, not to spy, but to reassure himself, because believing the worst was too scary, like jumping into the dark water of Puget Sound, not knowing what was down there. John was sitting in his office, staring at his computer screen, the lines of code blurring before his eyes, as if they were written on water blown about by the Seattle wind. And he thought that this day, a Friday, what should have been a normal day, with plans for an evening dinner with Emma, maybe ordering Thai from that place on the corner where they like to get pad Thai with shrimp, and then watching old comedies to laugh at the stupid things that reminded them of their early days, had suddenly taken an unexpected turn when Bob, his boss with the graying beard and the eternal golf jokes, walked into the room and announced that the client meeting had been canceled because of some problem on their end. Technical difficulties, guys, so everyone's off early. Go home and enjoy the weekend before the rain washes the whole city into the ocean. And John smiled, feeling a surge of joy, because that meant that he could leave at 3 instead of 6, buy flowers at Pike Place Market, those bright tulips Emma liked to put on the kitchen table, so they would remind her of spring, even in the gray Seattle November, and surprise her, cook dinner himself, maybe a grilled steak with vegetables that he had mastered from YouTube, and finally talk about those suspicions that had been gathering inside him like clouds before a storm. But today he had decided to push them away, to convince himself that everything was fine, that Emma was just busy with work, and those strange messages and new perfumes and delays were just coincidences because their love, 8 years together, could not be fake like those fake Rolexes they sold at the market. He packed quickly, saying goodbye to Sarah and Michael, who joked, "Hey, John, don't forget to invite us over for a barbecue if you're cooking something epic," and headed outside into the fine drizzle of rain, dampening his windbreaker but not dampening the mood, because his mind was already racing with plans. Stopping at the flower stand where the old lady with the accent always recommended something bright for the girl, then stopping at Whole Foods for a steak and some fresh vegetables, and home to their apartment in Belltown, where he'd light candles and put on a playlist of their favorite songs, from the Lumineers to old Bob Dylan, and tell Emma when she got back, let's forget about work, forget about being late, and just be us, like we used to be, and maybe even suggesting a spontaneous weekend getaway to the mountains to build a fire and look at the stars if the clouds were clear, because he felt that their marriage needed a spark, something to dispel those shadows of suspicion that had begun to poison his thoughts, especially after that anonymous email that he had dismissed as spam, but which still sat in his head like a splinter, whispering, check her evenings. But no, today he would be an optimist, a husband who believed in the best. On his way home, John stopped at the market, where the air was filled with the scent of fresh fish and flowers and fried donuts, and bought a bouquet of tulips, bright pink like Emma's cheeks when she was embarrassed by compliments on their first dates, and in the store he chose the best cuts of meat, adding a bottle of wine Cabernet Sauvignon, which they drank at the wedding and walked along the streets, feeling like a hero of a romantic movie where everything ends with a happy ending. But when he approached the house, he noticed that her car was already parked at the entrance, although she had to be at work until 5, and he thought, maybe she also left early to surprise me. And this warmed him, making him quicken his step, entering the entrance with a smile, climbing the stairs quietly so as not to frighten the moment, and inserting the key into the door of the apartment as carefully as if it were a secret code to their happiness. It was quiet inside, but not empty. There were muffled sounds coming from the bedroom, either laughter or sighs, and John, still holding the bouquet and the bag of groceries, walked down the hallway thinking, she's probably watching TV or calling her mother. But as he got closer, the sounds became clearer groans, heavy breathing, the creaking of the bed, and his heart sank as if someone had pressed pause on his life. And he pushed the bedroom door, which was ajar, and what he saw hit him like lightning on a clear day, tearing all illusions to pieces. Emma, naked on their bed, the same one where they had slept for 8 years, sharing secrets and plans, surrounded by three men. Richard, this charismatic boss in a suit that was now discarded on the floor. Mike, a bartender with tattoos whom he had never met, but now recognized from the description from her bachelorettes, and Trevor, a muscular trainer whose body glistened with sweat, and they were all in the midst of something John couldn't even name out loud, an orgy where bodies intertwined, hands caressed, lips whispered, and Emma, in the center, with her eyes closed and moans of pleasure, seemed alien to him, as if she were not his wife, but an actress in a porn film that had accidentally been turned on in their reality. Time slowed down, like in a movie where the hero sees betrayal in slow motion, and John was standing in the doorway. The bouquet had fallen from his hands, the tulips had scattered on the floor like broken dreams, and the bag of groceries had fallen with a thud. But no one noticed at first because they were too carried away. Richard was kissing her neck, whispering, "You're incredible, Emma. This is better than any project." Mike was stroking her hips. Like old times, only hotter, and Trevor, with his strong arms, was holding her, saying, "Move, baby, give me everything." And Emma was answering, "Yeah, guys, don't stop. This is what I've been missing." And at that moment, she opened her eyes, saw John, and her face was distorted with shock, as if a mirror had cracked, reflecting her own horror. "John, oh my God, John, it's not what you think," she cried, trying to push the men away, but they turned too, Richard with a smug grin that quickly turned to panic. "Shit, is that your husband?" "Emma, you said he was at work." Mike, standing up, "Hey, dude, calm down, it's just fun." Trevor, not moving, "Who is this guy?" We didn't know she was married, but John didn't hear them, the blood pounding in his ears like drums in a storm, and the world narrowed to this room, where the smell of sex mixed with his pain, and he felt something inside him break like an old branch in the wind, and the words burst out on their own, uncontrollable, a cry from the soul, full of rage and despair. "Your name is Crap, a woman who sells her body." And it echoed in the room like a gunshot, making everyone freeze, Emma to cry, the men to pull away, and John to realize that this was not just an insult, but the cry of his broken heart, which had beaten for her for 8 years, and was now bleeding on the floor along with those tulips. The chaos exploded instantly, like a bomb no one expected. Emma jumped up, grabbing the sheet to cover herself, tears streaming down her face. "John, please listen to me. This is a mistake. I didn't mean for you to find out like this. I love you, but life has become so boring. I was looking for adventure. Richard promised a career, Mike memories, Trevor passion, but you are my home. Forgive me, please." And she reached out to him, but John stepped back, his face pale as a ghost, and he looked at her like she was a stranger. "Do you love me? Is this love?" "In our bed with those bastards." 8 years, Emma, 8 years of me running in the mornings, making coffee, planning Hawaii, and you. You had sex with half the city behind my back. How could you?" And his voice shook, going from a scream to a whisper, because the pain was so sharp that it cut my throat like a knife. Richard, dressing quickly, trying to maintain his dignity. "Listen, mate, it's not your fault. Emma is an ambitious woman. She deserves more than your routine. I offered her the world, trips, promotion, and you. You're just an engineer in a small firm, no drama, leave, and we'll sort this out." But John turned to him, his eyes blazing. "Shut up, you corporate bastard. You're her boss. Did you use her, or did she use you? You're all parasites eating my life. Get out of here, all of you, before I do something I regret." And Mike, already in his pants, raised his hands. "Hey man, I knew Emma from school. It was nostalgic, nothing more. She said she was unhappy, that you didn't give her fire, but I didn't want to break up the family, honestly." And Trevor, still naked, stood like a statue. "I'm a coach, we just. Physically, no strings attached. She's not. I mentioned my husband, otherwise I wouldn't have gotten involved. Bro, sorry." But their excuses only added fuel to the fire, and John grabbed the nearest thing, a lamp from the bedside table, and threw it at the wall, where it shattered with a crash, the shards flying like his hopes. Emma was sobbing, falling to her knees. "John, don't. Let's talk. I'm confused. Everything changed after college. You became so predictable, and I wanted to fly, but I didn't want to hurt you. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm going to therapy. We'll save our marriage. Please don't go. And she was crawling towards him, but he pulled away. Save? After this? You ruined everything, Emma. Every night you stayed late, every text you deleted, every bachelorette party. It was a lie, and I believed it because I loved it, blindly, like an idiot. And now I see who you really are. A loose can of worms. Yes, that's the word. Because you sold our love for cheap adventures. And his words hurt her like bullets, but also him because he never thought he'd say that to the woman he idolized, and tears rolled down his cheeks, mixing with the rain behind him window, which grew louder, drumming on the glass like a guilty verdict. The men dressed in a hurry, Richard muttering, "This is the end, Emma. Don't call me any more. Your drama isn't worth my reputation." Mike, "I'm sorry, Em, but that was a mistake. Good luck to you both. Trevor, I'm leaving. I don't want any trouble." And they slipped out of the room, leaving the two of them in ruins, and John standing looking at Emma, who was sitting on the floor, hugging her knees. "What now, John? Divorce? I don't want to lose you. You're my rock." And he answered, his voice hoarse, "Rock? I've been your fool, Emma, but now I'm leaving, packing my bags and going to a friend's or a motel, I don't know. But this is the end, the day that changed everything, and your name. Yeah, it echoes in my head, a woman of easy virtue, but more pain than anger." And he turned, leaving the bedroom, hearing her screams, "Wait, John, please." But the door slammed, and he went out into the rain, which washed away the tears but not the pain, and he thought that life, so ordinary yesterday, had become chaos today from which there was no escape. But the chaos wasn't over. Emma, in her dressing gown, ran after him, screaming, "John, come back, let's talk. I'll explain everything from the beginning, like with Richard at the conference, with Mike at the bar, with Trevor in the hall. It was stupid, searching for myself, but I love you." And the neighbors looked out of the windows, and he stopped in the rain. "Explain. Why? So that I can see how deeply you betrayed me." "No, Emma, go back to your lovers, or find new ones, but without me." And she fell to her knees on the wet asphalt. "Please, give me a chance. We can start over, therapy, a holiday, anything." But he shook his head. "Chance? You killed him in that bedroom, goodbye," and walked away, leaving her sobbing in the rain, and in her head spinning, how to live on, and the night swallowed him up like an ocean. That night in the motel, John lay staring at the ceiling, remembering every detail, her moans, their faces, his words, and he cried, knowing that this was not a dream, but a reality that had changed everything forever. And tomorrow he would have to call a lawyer, divide things, but today there was only pain, echoing in his soul, like that phrase that had escaped in shock. John walked through the wet streets of Seattle, where the rain, which had become a downpour, lashed him in the face as if nature had decided to finish off what was left of his broken heart. And he didn't notice how his soaking windbreaker clung to his body and his sneakers squelched through puddles, because the whole world had narrowed to the pain that throbbed in his chest like an open wound. And every step he took through the dark alleys of Belltown, where the neon signs of bars and restaurants blinked like a mockery of his collapsed life, only intensified this storm of emotions, where rage, humiliation, and self-flagellation mixed into a cocktail that he could neither swallow nor spit out, but only carried within himself like a heavy weight that threatened to crush him right there on the corner of 2nd Avenue, where he stopped, breathing heavily, looking at the reflection in the window of a closed cafe, where his face, distorted by rain and grief, seemed alien, as if the man who had planned a romantic dinner with Emma that morning died in that bedroom, leaving behind only a shell full of questions. How could I have been so blind? How could I not have seen that she was lying? Why didn't I check sooner, leave sooner, save myself from this hell? He moved on, aimlessly, just to move, because to stand still was to drown in the thoughts that swirled around him like a whirlwind. The image of Emma, naked, surrounded by those three men, Richard with his smug grin, Mike with the tattoos he now hated, Trevor with his muscled body and her moans, those sounds he would never forget, as if they were burned into his brain, and the words he had screamed, "Your name is crap," echoing in his head, making him both ashamed of his cruelty and pleased because they were true, bitter as Seattle coffee without sugar. And he remembered her crying, begging. John, I'm sorry, it's a mistake. But a mistake is never so planned, with three lovers in their bed in their house, where they were making plans for Hawaii, where he was kissing her on the cheek mornings where they laughed at stupid jokes on The Office, and now those memories, so warm yesterday, have become knives piercing the heart with every step. John pulled out his phone, which was vibrating in his pocket for the 10th time. Emma. Her name was flashing across the screen, and he looked at it like it was the enemy, his fingers shaking with the desire to answer and unleash all his fury. But instead he hit reject because talking to her now would be like jumping into an abyss, and he wasn't ready, not now, not when the storm inside him had yet to subside, but was only gaining strength, and he thought of that anonymous letter he'd received yesterday. Your wife is not where she says she is. And now it didn't seem like spam, but a screaming truth that he'd ignored like a fool because he'd wanted to believe in their love, in their 8 years, in their morning runs together, when they'd stop at Harbor Brew and chat about little things. And he cursed himself for being so blind, for letting her lie, for not noticing the new perfume, erased messages, her detachment, which now seemed as obvious as the rain that had been falling all his life in this damn city. He stopped at the waterfront, where the Puget Sound waves crashed against the piers, making a dull rhythmic sound like a metronome of his pain, and took out his phone again, scrolling through his contacts until he found a name. Zach, his childhood friend from Oregon, the guy he'd grown up with in a small town, fishing in the river and sharing their first cigarettes behind the barn and dreaming of a future where John would be an engineer and Zach would be a mechanic. And even though their paths had diverged when John went off to college and Zach stayed behind to fix cars in their hometown, they still called each other every few months to reminisce about old times or to laugh about life. And now John knew that Zach was the only one who would understand, who wouldn't judge, who would listen, because that's how he'd always been, straightforward, with a rough humor, but with a heart that didn't break under the weight of other people's problems. He pressed call, and after 3 rings he heard a familiar voice, hoarse from cigarettes and work. Hey, Johnny, damn it, are you alive? What are you calling on a night like this? The rain probably washed away your Seattle. John tried to smile, but his voice cracked. Zach, I'm in deep shit, man. Seriously, I need to vent or I'm going crazy. And Zach caught the tone right away, putting the jokes aside. Hey, what's wrong? Are you okay? Tell me, I'm all ears. Just let me get a beer out of the fridge. And John, standing under the streetlight where the light mixed with the rain, started talking, the words pouring out like this downpour, uncontrollably. Emma. She's shit, Zach. I came home today. I wanted to surprise you. And she, with 3 guys in our bedroom, in our bed, I saw everything. Richard, her boss, some bartender, a trainer from the gym, they were there, like in a porno, and she was in the middle, and I called her a slut, I screamed, I couldn't hold back, and now I'm walking down the street, I don't know where, and everything that happened, these last 8 years, this is lies, Zach, all lies. And he fell silent, gasping for breath, hearing Zach coughing into the phone, clearly choking on his beer. Jesus, John, this is a nightmare, pardon the word, but what the hell? 3 guys, Emma, that Emma who seemed so perfect. Man, I don't know what to say. This is like a punch in the gut. Are you holding up? Where are you now? Zach spoke quickly, with that genuine concern that reminded John why they had been friends for so many years, and he answered, looking out over the bay, I'm on the boardwalk, walking. I don't know where. I just can't go home. It's all soaked in her, them. I don't know what to do. Zach, I loved her. I trusted her. And she destroyed me. And I blame myself. Maybe I was boring. I didn't give her what she wanted. Maybe it's my fault. And Zach interrupted. Hey, stop. Don't you dare, Johnny. It's not your fault. You were a good husband. I saw how hard you tried for her, cooked, planned this Hawaii of yours, and she chose this 3 men shit. This is not about you. This is about her. She's sick or whatever. But not you, you hear me? You don't deserve this shit. John nodded, though Zach couldn't see, and the tears mingled with the rain on his cheeks because Zach's words were like a life preserver. But he was still drowning in memories that floated up like flotsam. Their wedding in a park by Lake Union, where Emma, in the simple white dress they'd picked out together, laughed and danced in the rain because the umbrellas had been forgotten. and he thought it would be forever. Their first night in this apartment, drinking wine on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived yet, and she'd whisper, "This is our home, John, our little world." Their morning runs, when they'd stop at a cafe, and she'd steal a sip of his Americano, laughing, "Yours tastes better." And now those moments, so pure, were poisoned because he saw her differently in that bedroom with them, and it was like someone had ripped out pages of their story and set them on fire, leaving only ashes. And he said to Zach, "I don't know how to live my life, man. I see her everywhere, in every corner, and it kills me. I want to hate her, but I love her, and that's the worst thing. How can I love after this?" Zach sighed, his voice softening. "John, love isn't a switch you can turn off. It's going to hurt, but you're stronger than you think. Remember how you got through your dad's death. You held on, you worked, you went to school, you can get through this, but you need time. Don't go home. Come live with me in Oregon. Stay for a couple weeks. We'll fix some cars. We'll go fishing like we used to. Just give yourself a break, and with her. Shit, I don't know, divorce probably, but don't think about that right now. Just breathe, okay?" And John nodded again, feeling his friend's words extinguish the fire inside him a little, but not completely, because the rage was still burning, and he replied, "I'll think about it, Zach. Thank you for being here. I'll call tomorrow. I have to go, or I'm going to fall apart right here." And hung up when the phone vibrated again, Emma again, and he swiped the call away without reading her messages, which were probably full of apologies, but he didn't want to hear them, not now, when her voice in his head was mixing with those moans from the bedroom. Meanwhile, Emma was sitting on the floor of their apartment, in the very bedroom where it had happened, the sheet still crumpled like a witness to a crime, and she was sobbing, clutching the phone that John wasn't picking up, and she was dialing his number over and over again, leaving messages. "John, please answer. I know what I did. I'm terrible, but I want to explain. I didn't mean for this to happen. I'm confused. I'm sorry. Come back. Let's talk." But the silence was louder than her screams, and she was looking at the scattered tulips he'd brought, and she was remembering how he'd always bought her flowers, even when they were students and barely had enough money for coffee, and how he'd looked at her with such love that she felt like she was the center of the world. And now she'd ruined it, with her own hands, and the guilt that had once been just a little prick was now tearing through her like a storm, because she'd seen his face, his pain, his scream, and she knew that deserved every word. But she still wanted him back because John was her anchor, even if she was looking for adventure with Richard, nostalgia with Mike, passion with Trevor, and now, without him, she felt lost, like a ship without a rudder. She stood up, trying to collect herself, and went to the bathroom to wash her face, but the mirror reflected her face tear-stained, with smeared mascara, and she thought, "Is this me? Is this who I have become?" And she remembered how it all began. Richard at that conference, his words about her potential, Mike at the bar, resurrecting the past, Trevor in the hall, giving her a sense of strength, and how she justified herself. This is not a betrayal, this is a search for yourself. But now, standing in an empty apartment, she realized that she was not looking for herself, but an escape from boredom, from the fear that life would pass her by. And this escape had cost her everything, and she dialed John again, whispering into a voice message. "I'm not making excuses, I'm guilty, but I love you. I always have. Give me a chance to explain, not for me, for us." But the phone was silent, and she fell onto the couch, hugging herself, hearing the rain hitting the windows as if mourning their marriage. Meanwhile, John reached the park by the Space Needle, where he and Emma had once eaten ice cream, laughing at the tourists, and sat down on a bench, ignoring the rain that soaked him to the skin, and remembered their first anniversary when they had climbed the tower, and she had said, "With you, I feel like I can do anything, John," and he had said, "We'll be happy, Em, forever." And that promise now seemed like a mockery, because happiness turned out to be fragile as glass, and he beat himself in his thoughts. Why didn't I notice? Why didn't I fight for her? Maybe if I had been more interesting, if I had given her adventures, she wouldn't have looked for them with others. But then the rage would come back. "No, it's not my fault. She chose this. She lied. She betrayed." And he sat until the rain died down, and the storm inside continued to rage, and he knew that tomorrow a new life would begin without her. But today he just wanted to survive, get through this night where every breath was a struggle. The rain in Seattle seemed to never stop, but by morning it had eased to a light drizzle, leaving the air damp and heavy as John's thoughts, who had been up all night, lying on a hard mattress in a motel on the edge of town with the TV blaring old commercials and the smell of damp mixing with his own pain, and he was staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in the bedroom last night in his head. Emma, her lovers, their moans, his own scream that had escaped him like a blade, and now, sitting in the little cafe called Harbor Brew, where he and Emma had once drank coffee after jogging, laughing at the tourists and planning the future. He was waiting for her because she had begged to see him in the messages he had finally read that morning. Every word of them. "I'm sorry, John. Let me explain. I don't want to lose us cutting like a knife." But he had agreed, not because he believed her excuses, but because he wanted to look her in the eyes, say it was the end, and walk away, leaving behind 8 years that now seemed like a mirage, like the lights of a city reflected in puddles, disappearing with the first step. The cafe was almost empty, just a couple of students in the corner scrolling through their laptops, and Mike, the barista, the one with the tattoos and the nose piercing who always knew his order, wiping down the counter, glancing at John, whose face, pale and drawn, seemed to scream disaster, and John was sitting by the window, looking out onto the street where passers-by were hiding under umbrellas, and his coffee, a double Americano without sugar, was getting cold on the table because he couldn't bring himself to drink it, couldn't do anything but keep himself from exploding when she walked in, because the storm of emotions that had started yesterday hadn't died down. It just lurked like an animal ready to pounce, and he knew that this meeting would be the last one, a full stop in their story, because after what he'd seen, after he'd checked her phone secretly while she was sleeping the morning before he'd left and found messages from Richard and Mike and Trevor, every word, from "meet me in the pub, like old times," to "you're incredible, Emma, let's do it again," was like a bullet, piercing the last of his faith in her. The door rang and Emma walked in, her brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her eyes red from crying and dark circles under them like she hadn't slept either, and she was wearing a plain gray sweatshirt and jeans, no makeup, no that new perfume he hated, like she wanted to look like the Emma he'd known in college, simple and sincere. But John saw only betrayal in her now, and when she sat down across from him, her hands were shaking, clutching her purse, and she began quietly, "John, thank you for coming. I don't know where to start, but I have to explain. I don't want it to end like this." And he looked at her, his eyes cold as the bay outside, and he answered, his voice low, almost a growl, "Explain. What can you explain, Emma? How did you have sex with 3 men in our bed? Or how you lied to me for months, deleting messages, invented the hen parties? I know everything. I've seen your messages. Richard, Mike, Trevor, do you think I'm blind?" Her face went white as if he'd hit her, and she clamped her hand over her mouth, whispering, You looked at my phone? John, it's not fair, But he cut her off, his voice rising, drawing the barista's gaze. "It's not fair? Are you serious? It's not fair that I found out the truth about your lovers? Richard, your boss, who promised you a career in exchange for sex in his penthouse, Mike, your high school boyfriend with whom you reminisced in his car, and Trevor, that trainer who apparently trained you for more than just the gym. I read everything, Emma, every word, every can't wait, every that was incredible. And you dare talk about fairness?" His fists clenched on the table, the coffee shook in its mug, and Emma began to cry, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't take her eyes off him. "Yes, it's my fault, I'm terrible, but it wasn't just sex, John, I'm confused. Work, stress, you're always so stable, and I wanted fire, adventure, I didn't want to hurt you, I love you, I always have." John laughed, but it was bitter, like bad wine. "Love? You call that love? 8 years, Emma. I ran in the mornings to get in shape for you, made coffee, planned Hawaii, and you. You were looking for fire with 3 men in our bed in our house, where we swore to be together forever, and now you sit here, crying and expecting me to forgive. No, Emma, this is the end. I want a divorce, and I'm not kidding. I can't live with this, seeing you and knowing what you did behind my back." His words were like blows, each one hitting its mark, and she winced, shaking her head. "Divorce? John, please no, we can go to therapy. I'll stop everything. I'll quit. I won't see them anymore. I'll do anything to get you back. It was a mistake, stress, I was weak. But I don't want to lose us. You're my home, my anchor. Please give me a chance. He looked at her, and for a second he felt a flicker of pity. She looked so lost, like the girl he met in college, laughing at his jokes and dreaming of travel. But then he remembered their bedroom, her moans, the faces of those men, and the pity was drowned in rage. Your anchor? I was your fool, Emma. I believed you even when I saw the signs, your delays, your new perfume, your deleted messages. I told myself it was paranoia, but yesterday I saw the truth, and it tore me apart. You didn't just make a mistake. You chose this. You planned it. You lied. And now you want me to swallow it and move on. No, I can't. I don't want to see you, hear you. I want a divorce, period. His voice shook, but was as firm as the asphalt beneath their feet, and Emma began to sob louder, attracting the attention of the students in the corner who began to whisper. But she didn't care. John, please, I know how you feel. I saw your pain yesterday, and it killed me. I'm not like that. I'm not an easy woman like you said. I lost myself. Richard gave me a career. Mike gave me a past. Trevor gave me passion. But you are my love. I don't want to live without you. Let's start over. I will fix everything. At that moment, her phone, lying on the table, vibrated, and the name Richard appeared on the screen, as if fate had decided to add fuel to the fire, and John looked at it, his eyes narrowed. Oh, your boss again. What, wants another extra hour? Answer me, Emma, come on, show me how much you love me. And his sarcasm was like acid, eating away at the last of their connection, and she grabbed the phone, swiping away the call. No, John, that's not it. I won't answer. It doesn't mean anything. It was a mistake. I swear I'll quit. I'll cut off all contact. Just don't leave. But he stood up, pushing his chair back so hard that it creaked on the wooden floor. Quit. Don't quit. I don't care. You destroyed us, Emma. And this call is just a reminder that you won't change. You will always look for fire. And I don't want to be ashes. I'm leaving. My lawyer will contact you. Goodbye. He turned to leave, but she jumped up, grabbing his hand. John, wait, please, I beg you. Let's at least talk again. Not like this, not in a cafe at home. I'll tell you everything, from the beginning, how it happened. I don't want a divorce, I want you. He pulled his hand away, his face stony, but his eyes shining with tears. Home, in that bedroom where you were with them. No, Emma, there's no home anymore, just rubble, and I don't want to clean it up. You made a choice. Now live with it like I live with this pain. He walked out without looking back into the rain, which had picked up again, his footsteps on the wet pavement like hammer blows hammering nails into the coffin of their marriage. And Emma was left sitting there sobbing, her phone vibrating again, Richard again, and she threw it on the table, screaming, "Fucking hell, leave me alone." And Mike the barista approached cautiously. Hey, are you okay? Do you want some water? But she shook her head, whispering, No, nothing's okay. I've lost everything. And sat looking out the window where John had disappeared into the gray haze, her heart breaking with guilt, shame, and the realization that she had destroyed what was most important to her. John walked down the street, feeling the rain wash away the tears but not the pain, and he remembered their first meeting in college, the way she smiled, the way they worked on a project until the night, drinking coffee and laughing, and the way she said, "You make me a better person, John," and he believed that they would be together forever. But that was in the past now, and he knew that divorce was the only way, because living with her knowing the truth would be like living with a ghost. And he called Zach, his friend, to say, Dude, I did it. I told her about the divorce now. Now I don't know what's next, but I'm coming to you. I need to get out of this town. And Zach said, Come on over, Johnny. We'll figure it out. Hang in there. And John walked on in the rain, with a heart that still beat despite the wounds, and with a determination to start a new life, without her, without the lies, but with a pain that he knew would be with him for a long time. Emma, left in the cafe, looked at her phone, where the messages from Richard kept coming. Emma, we need to talk. This is not the end. And she deleted them, one by one, realizing that he was part of her downfall, like Mike, like Trevor, and that the only person she needed had just left, and she whispered, "I'll fix this, John. I'll find you. I'll prove that I can be better." But the words were drowned out by the sound of the rain outside the window, and she knew that this would not be a fight with him, but with herself, with the one who chose adventure over love and now had to pay the price. John was driving down I-5 toward Oregon in an old pickup truck he'd borrowed from a coworker of Michael's because his own car was parked at a house he didn't want to go to, afraid to face Emma or the memories that still burned like an open wound, the rain beating on the windshield, his only companion on this road, the radio playing an old Springsteen song, "I'm on Fire," and the irony of those words cut him because he was actually burning, not with love like he once had, but with a rage that smoldered like embers beneath the ashes of pain, and somewhere deep inside, between thoughts of divorce and conversations with Zach, his childhood friend who was waiting for him in a small town by the coast, John realized that just leaving wasn't enough, that Emma's betrayal, her lies, her bodies entwined with Richard and Mike and Trevor in their bedroom, demanded an answer, not just for her, but for them, the ones who had ruined his life, and that thought, at first as timid as a whisper, grew into a plan, cold and calculating as the code he wrote in the office, and he decided that revenge wasn't just a way to vent his rage, it was a way to take back control, even if it meant becoming something he'd never been, a man who destroyed, not built. He stopped at a gas station in Tacoma, where the neon sign flickered in the puddles, and as he filled up, he took out his phone, an old iPhone that still held traces of his life with Emma photos from their trips, messages of love that now seemed mocking, and he created an anonymous email from a new account he had registered right there, under the hum of the coffee machine at the convenience store. And he wrote a letter to the HR department of Harper Dynamics, Emma's company, where her boss Richard, that charismatic bastard in Tom Ford suits, reigned like a king, and in the letter, short but venomous, he laid out everything. Emma's affair with Richard, their extra hours in his office, their meetings in the penthouse, backing it up with details from the messages he'd seen on her phone. "You're incredible, Emma, let's do Tokyo again," and added that this was not only a violation of ethics, but also a threat to the company's reputation, and he sent it him, feeling his fingers tremble, not from fear, but from some dark satisfaction, because he knew that this letter was like a bomb that would blow up Richard's career, and maybe Emma's too, and this was the first step on the path of revenge, which he chose without looking back. 2 days later, in Oregon, in Zach's house, where it smelled of garage oil and freshly brewed coffee, John got confirmation. Zach, who had been following the news in Seattle through friends, told him that a scandal had broken out at Harper Dynamics, an anonymous letter had reached the board of directors, and Richard had been fired for unethical behavior, and Emma had been suspended pending an investigation, and Zach had clapped him on the shoulder. "Dude, you did this. Cool, but is that too much? I thought you'd just get a divorce and forget." And John, sipping a beer on the porch, watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean, answered hoarsely, "Forget, Zach, I see them every time I close my eyes. Richard, that bastard, promised her the world, and he ruined mine. He deserved it, and this is just the beginning." And Zach frowned but said nothing, because he saw something new in his friend's eyes, not just pain, but cold determination that was frightening, as if John, the same guy who always avoided conflict, had become a different person. Back in Seattle a week later, John decided that Richard was just the first act, and the next one was Mike, the bartender at the Iron Anchor, whose tattoos and nostalgic high school talk with Emma were part of her betrayal, and he headed to the pub on a Friday night when Capitol Hill was buzzing with music and laughter, and the air was thick with the smell of hops and wet asphalt. And when he walked into the Iron Anchor, he saw Mike behind the bar right away, his long hair pulled back into a ponytail, and the smile he gave customers seemed mocking to John, and he sat down at the bar and ordered a whiskey, and when Mike handed him a glass, John looked him in the eye and said, "You're Mike, right? The one who had sex with my wife in our bed." And the pub went silent, as if someone had turned off the music, and Mike went pale, putting down the bottle and said, "Hey man, I didn't know she was married. When we started, she said she was unhappy. It was a one-time thing, I'm sorry. Let's do it without problems, okay?" But John didn't want no problem. His fists clenched, and he stood up, his voice shaking with rage. One time, you were in my bedroom with her, with the others. You knew she wasn't alone, and you still did it, you piece of shit. You think your tattoos and nostalgia give you the right to ruin someone else's life. And before Mike could answer, John had grabbed him by the shirt over the bar, and the bartender, trying to break free, pushed him back, and it was like a spark in a powder keg, and John punched, and his fist caught Mike's jaw, and he went down on the floor, and the customers were screaming, and someone was calling security, but John kept punching until Mike's nose was bleeding and Mike was screaming, "Stop it, I didn't mean to, I'm fucking sorry." But John could only see that night and Emma and their bed, and the rage was blinding him, until the security guard pulled him away and threw him out into the rain, where he stood breathing hard and his knuckles were bruised. But there was no relief, only an emptiness that was growing inside him like an abyss. Next up was Trevor, the trainer from Peak Pulse, and John, not giving himself time to cool down, drove there the next day, knowing that Saturday classes were peak attendance, and the gym was full of people sweating on treadmills and weights, and Trevor, with his ripped body and smug grin, was leading a CrossFit class, and John walked in without signing up and stood against the wall, watching Trevor boss the class around. "Come on, 5 more reps, feel the power." And when the class was over, John walked over, his voice loud for everyone to hear. "Trevor, are you the guy who sleeps with married women? My wife, Emma, was at your apartment, right? You trained her after class in your bed." And the room froze, people looked at each other, and Trevor, blushing, tried to joke. "Hey, dude, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a coach. Let's go outside and talk calmly." But John didn't want to calmly. He stepped closer, his voice cutting like a razor. "Calmly? You had sex with my wife, knowing that she was married, and now you're going to pretend to be innocent. Tell everyone how you helped her in the locker room, or should I show you the messages where you wrote, 'Move, baby, give me everything'?" The crowd began to buzz. Someone was filming on a phone, and Trevor, losing his composure, muttered, "Listen, I didn't know. She didn't talk about her husband. It was just chemistry. I'm sorry. I didn't want any trouble." But John spat on the floor, his eyes blazing. "Chemistry? You ruined my marriage. You, Richard, Mike, you're all parasites. And I want everyone here to know what a hero you are, sleeping with other people's wives." And he walked away, leaving Trevor under the gaze of clients who were whispering, and the trainer shouting after him, "It's not fair, it's not my fault." But John did not turn around, feeling the adrenaline leave, and in its place there was an emptiness, cold as the Seattle wind, and he realized that Trevor's humiliation, the fight with Mike, Richard's dismissal, none of this brought him peace, did not heal the wound, but only deepened its loneliness, which was now his only companion. He went back to the motel, where his stuff lay in the corner like a reminder of the life he'd lost, and sat on his bed looking at his phone, where there were 17 missed calls from Emma and the texts. "John, I know what you did to Richard. Please talk to me. I don't blame you. I deserved it, but give me a chance." And he deleted them without reading the rest, because her voice, even in text, was like salt in the wound, and he called Zach, his voice shaking. "Zach, I did it. I blew them all up. Richard got fired. Mike got beat up. Trevor was embarrassed. But shit, I feel nothing but emptiness. It didn't help. I thought revenge would give me strength, but I'm only sinking deeper." And Zach paused and said, "Johnny, revenge is like beer. You think it'll save you, but then you get a hangover. You punish them, but not yourself. Save them. Come back, man. Leave this shit behind. Start over. You're stronger than you think." John nodded, though Zach couldn't see, and lay down, staring at the ceiling, knowing that revenge had destroyed not only them, but him too, leaving only shadows of who he was. And now, with the rain pounding outside, he had to find a way to move on, not with Emma, not with rage, but with himself, alone but alive. The rain in Seattle had thinned out, as if the city had decided to give John a break when he moved into a new apartment in the Fremont neighborhood. A small brick building with a view of a canal where kayaks glided across the water, like a reminder that life goes on, even when it seems to stand still. And John, unpacking boxes of books and clothes and the old coffee pot he'd taken from his and Emma's house, felt strangely liberated but also lost, as if he'd been dropped off on an unfamiliar shore without a map. Because this apartment, with its white walls and empty shelves, wasn't just a new place, but a symbol of the end of 8 years with Emma, the end of their Netflix nights together, the end of his illusions about a love that he'd thought could weather any storm, but had crumbled under the weight of her betrayal. And now, standing by the window with a mug of black coffee, looking out at the city lights that winked like stars in the night sky, he thought that loneliness it's not just pain, it's a chance to find himself. The John who once dreamed of more than a stable job and a predictable life. And that's why he signed up for therapy, started hiking, and unexpectedly for himself, opened his heart to something new, which came in the form of Sarah, a colleague whose smile and sincerity slowly but surely pulled him out of the darkness. It had been 3 months since he'd walked out of the Harbor Brew, leaving Emma in tears, her pleas for forgiveness he couldn't accept because every word she said reminded him of that bedroom she'd shared with Richard and Mike and Trevor. And though his revenge, the letter to Harper Dynamics, the fight with Mike, the humiliation of Trevor had provided a momentary satisfaction, it had quickly been replaced by an emptiness, as if he'd burned out a part of himself along with them. And now, sitting in the office of his therapist, Miss Linda, a woman with kind eyes and a voice as soothing as the sound of the ocean, John was learning to pick apart that emptiness like a piece of code with a bug, trying to figure out why he'd ignored the signs of Emma's betrayal for so long, why he'd blamed himself, and how to move on without letting the pain define him. Linda, with her notebook and her habit of tilting her head slightly when he spoke, would ask, "John, when was the last time you felt truly alive, not just existing, but alive?" And he would think, remembering not evenings with Emma, but moments from his childhood in Oregon, when he and his father would fish on the river, or those rare days in college when he would go alone into the mountains to watch the sunrise, and he would answer, "Probably when I was alone in the mountains, where there was nothing but the wind and the rocks, where you felt like you were part of something bigger," and she would nod. "Then start there, John. Find what makes you alive, not for someone else, but for yourself." The word stuck with him like a seed slowly growing, and within a week he had joined a local hiking club, bought new boots and a pack from Ray, and started heading out into the Cascade Mountains on weekends, where the trails that led to peaks like Mount Rainier and Snoqualmie Pass weren't just a physical challenge, but a way to clear his head, because out there among the pines and the rocks, where the air was crisp and the silence was deafening, he could breathe without pain, without the memory of that bedroom, and every step up, every sweat running down his forehead, was a step away from the past, away from the John who was a victim, and closer to the one who could be stronger. On one such outing, on the trail near Talus Lake, he laughed for the first time in a long time when another hiker, a guy named Kevin, slipped on a wet rock and playfully shouted, "Damn, nature clearly doesn't want me to conquer this mountain." And John, helping him up, felt something inside him thaw, as if the ice that had bound his heart began to crack. It was in the office at Cascade Tech Solutions that he began to notice Sarah, the coworker who had always been part of the team, but had once seemed like a mere backdrop young, with short, blonde hair and a habit of wearing brightly colored sneakers with business trousers. She was the one who cracked jokes at meetings, brought home homemade muffins on Fridays, and always asked, "Hey, John, how was your run today? Did the rain wash you out?" With such sincerity that he couldn't help but smile even on the darkest days after the breakup. Sarah wasn't like Emma, not a bright star that lit up the room, but a quiet light that warmed you slowly. And one night when they were staying late in the office, working on a bug in the code for a new client, she looked at him over the top of her computer screen and said, "You know, John, you're always so serious, but I can tell you have a spark you just hide, so tell me, what do you like besides coding and coffee?" And he, for the first time in months, felt like opening up, telling her about the mountains, about how the summit made you forget the pain, and she nodded. "Cool, I like to go mountaineering too. Want to go together on Saturday. There's a trail up Mount C that's easy but has jaw-dropping views." And off they went on a Saturday under a rare clear sky in Seattle, and Sarah, in her green jacket and a backpack full of sandwiches and a thermos of tea, chatted about her life, how she had grown up in Montana, where the mountains were her playground, how she had moved to Seattle for a job, but missed the simplicity of small towns, and John listened, feeling her voice, light and alive, drowning out the echoes of the past, and at the top, As they sat on a rock looking out at the snow-capped peaks of the Cascades, she said, "John, you don't have to tell me, but I know you've been through something hard. I can see it in your eyes. But you're here and you're moving forward, and it's cool, really." And he looked at her freckles like stars on her cheeks. And for the first time in months, he felt warm, not hurt. And he said, "Thank you, Sarah. You have no idea how much that means to hear." Flashbacks to the past came unbidden, especially at night when he lay in his new apartment, the walls still smelling of fresh paint, and remembered how he and Emma had danced in their old living room to the Lumineers, how she had laughed when he had spilled wine on the carpet, and how they had planned Hawaii, lying in bed, picturing beaches and palm trees, and these memories were like old photographs that you wanted to keep, but that hurt to look at because they reminded you of who he had been, naive, in love, blind to her lies. In therapy, he talked about it with Linda, confessing, "I hate that I still love her, deep down, even after everything, and I hate myself for it." And Linda, adjusting her glasses, would answer, "Love doesn't disappear overnight, John, but it doesn't have to hold you hostage. You learn to let go, not because she deserves it, but because you deserve to be free." And these words became his mantra, repeated on the trails, where each step was like a line of code rewriting his life. Sarah became part of that rewriting, not right away, not as a replacement for Emma, but as someone who reminded him that trust was possible, and their meetings, first hikes, then coffee at Harbor Brew, where Mike, the barista, no longer looked at him with pity, but simply served him coffee with a smile, turned into dinners where Sarah would cook pasta in her small Capitol Hill apartment, laughing at his attempts to chop an onion without crying, and say, "John, you're an engineer, and you cut like it's the first time you've held a knife. Let me show you." And he would laugh, feeling laughter creeping back into his life, like someone had opened a window in a stuffy room. One day after dinner, as they sat on her balcony looking out at the city lights, she touched his hand and said, "I don't know what you had, but I see you trying and I like it. You don't have to be perfect, just be yourself." And he didn't respond, but squeezed her hand, feeling his heart beat faster, not from fear, but from hope that maybe he could trust again. But the past wouldn't let go completely. One day, in the mail, he found a letter from a lawyer confirming that Emma had signed the divorce papers, and a note from her. "John, I know I don't deserve to be forgiven, but I hope you find happiness. I will always love you." And he closed his laptop without answering because the words were empty, like their old apartment that he had left. But this letter reminded him of how far he had come, from a victim screaming in rage to a man learning to live for himself. In the mountains, on another trail, he told Sarah about his childhood, about fishing with his father, and she listened, and then she said, "You are like these mountains, John, strong but with cracks, and that's okay, the cracks make you real." And he smiled, thinking that maybe loneliness is not the end, but the beginning, and Sarah, with her sneakers and sincerity, was part of that beginning. That evening, back in his apartment, John stood by the window, looking out at the canal, and thought that rebirth was not a moment, but a process, slow as the growth of a tree, and he was not the old John, but he didn't want to be, because the new John, with his hiking and therapy and Sarah, was learning to trust again, not in the world, not in Emma, but in himself, and that was the biggest step of all. Seattle was waking up to a rare sun that broke through the clouds, bathing the city in a soft golden light, and John stood by the window of his new apartment in Fremont, holding a mug of coffee, no longer as bitter as it used to be because he had started adding a spoonful of sugar, as if it were a symbol of his desire to soften the taste of life. And he looked out at the canal, where kayaks glided slowly across the water and seagulls circled over the pier, screaming about the freedom that now seemed to him not just a dream, but a reality that he was building step by step, day by day, after everything that had torn his world apart into pieces. Emma's betrayal, that bedroom where he found her with Richard, Mike, and Trevor, his own cry, "Your name is crap," which burst out of him then, like the cry of a wounded animal, and now, 5 months later, that cry was an echo, distant, like the sound of the waves he heard in Oregon at Zach's, where he began to put himself back together, and today, on this clear day, he felt that he was ready for the final chord, for the moment when the past would finally be left behind, and ahead would be only his new life with hikes in the Cascade Mountains, with therapy with Sarah, who became not just a colleague, but a light that gently but persistently broke through the darkness of his loneliness. He put on his jacket, the same one he'd bought for hiking, stained from the dirt on the trails of Mount C, and decided that today he would go to the Space Needle, the place that had once been his and Emma's, where they'd eaten ice cream and laughed at tourists and made plans for the future. And now he wanted to take it back, make it his own, a symbol not of their love, but of his strength, his ability to weather the storm and come out into the light. But before that, he knew there was one more meeting to come. Emma had written him yesterday, a long letter, not emailed but handwritten, delivered by courier to his office, and in it she had begged for one last meeting, promising, "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it, but let me say it, John, for you, for who we were." And he had agreed, not because he wanted her back, but because he felt like this conversation was like the last line of code closing a program that had been hanging in his mind for too long. They met in Gasworks Park, by an old industrial structure where the rusty chimneys and towers made a strange contrast with the green grass and the view of Lake Union, and Emma was standing there in her blue coat, her hair down like it had been in their college days, but her face was different, not bright like it used to be, but tired, with lines he hadn't noticed before, and she had her hands in her pockets as if she were afraid they would give away her trembling. John came over, his heart beating steadily, not like that time in the cafe where he had screamed about divorce, but calmly, as if he was ready for anything, and he said, "Emma, I'm here, talk, but know that it won't change anything. I've closed this door." She nodded, her eyes shining with tears, but she held on, her voice quiet but firm. "John, I don't expect you to forgive me. I know what I did. I ruined us. I ruined you, and I live with it every day. But I want you to know that I am not who I was in that bedroom. I was lost. I was stupid. I was looking for something that was missing, and that was my weakness, not your fault." John looked at her, feeling the old wound stir but not bleed, and he answered, "Do you think that explains it? You lied to me, Emma, for months, made up hen nights, deleted messages, slept with Richard, Mike, Trevor in our bed, and I planned Hawaii, made coffee, believed in us, and you call that weakness? It was a choice, your choice, and I paid for it." She took a step closer, her voice shaking. "I know it was a choice, and the worst one in my life. I lost my job, my friends, myself, because I realized that without you, I am nothing. Richard was a mistake. He used me. Mike was nostalgia. Trevor was just a body. But you were my home, and I want to try again. I'm in therapy. I quit. I broke up with them. Give me a chance, John. I will do anything to get you back." He shook his head. His eyes were cold, but not angry, just calm like the lake in front of them. "Emma, you don't understand. It's not about forgiveness. I don't hate you. I'm not even angry anymore. I just don't want you in my life. You broke something that can't be fixed. I'm not the John who loved you. I'm different, and this John is moving on without you." She started crying, her voice getting louder. "But we were happy, remember? In college, at the wedding in Paris, when we walked along the Seine, you said I was your star. We can get that back, John. Please don't push me away." He remembered those moments dancing in the rain at their wedding, her laughing when he spilled wine in their first apartment, kissing by the Eiffel Tower, but those flashbacks that had once warmed him were now like old photographs, faded and distant, and he said, "I remember, Emma, but those memories are not a reason to return. They are a part of me, but not of the future. I choose myself, and I wish for you to find your way, but it is not with me." Her phone rang, and she quickly turned it off, but John saw the name, Richard, and it brought back a faint shadow of the past, not anger, just tired irony, and he said, "He's still calling. See, Emma, you haven't changed. You're still in a world I don't want to be in. Goodbye." He turned and walked away, hearing her cry, "John, wait, it's not what you think." But he didn't turn around, walking to the car, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders, like he was shedding an old skin, and he drove to the Space Needle, to the place that was supposed to be his, not theirs, and in that moment he knew that this was the final chord, the end of their story and the beginning of his own. on the observation deck of the Space Needle, where the wind was crisp and the city spread out below like a map of his life, John stood holding the railing and looked out over the bay, at the mountains, at the lights that flickered like promises of a new beginning, and he thought about how far he had come from the day his world had ended. He remembered shouting, "Your name is crap," how the word had been a cry of pain, but now it was just an echo, distant as the noise of the city below, and he felt stronger, not because he had taken revenge. The letter, the fight, the humiliation had haunted him, but because he had survived, grown, found himself in the mountains, in therapy, in Sarah waiting for him down at the cafe at the base of the tower, with her brightly colored sneakers and her smile that didn't promise stars but gave warmth. Sarah had come into his life as quietly as a ray of sunshine breaking through a cloud, and their hikes in the Cascades, their dinners at her apartment where she taught him how to cook pasta, their conversations on her balcony where she would say, "John, you don't have to be perfect, just be," had become the foundation on which he was building anew him. Yesterday, after the hike on Mount Rainier, as they sat by the fire, she had touched his arm and said, "I don't know what happened in your past, but I'm glad you're here with me, and if you want to tell me, I'll listen, and if you don't, we'll just move forward together." And he didn't tell her, not then, but he squeezed her hand, feeling the trust he thought he'd lost forever return, slowly, like a river flowing to the ocean, and he knew that Sarah was not a replacement for Emma, but something new, something of her own, something real. Standing on the landing, he remembered a flashback to a day with Emma on this same tower, 7 years ago, when she was eating ice cream and he was taking a picture of her against the city, and she had laughed, "John, you're going to make me famous with these pictures." And he'd said, "You're already a star, Em," and it had been true then, but now he could see that stars might fall, and he couldn't. He was like these mountains, solid and cracked, but alive. He pulled out his phone, where there was a text from Sarah. "I'm down at the cafe ordering you an Americano. Take your time and enjoy the view." And he smiled because she knew how to give him space but be there, and that was something he'd never felt with Emma, the freedom to be himself without having to anchor her. John came down, entered the cafe where Sarah was sitting with a book and coffee, and when she looked up, her smile was like a promise that life could be good, and he sat down opposite her, saying, "Thank you for waiting. I'm ready to go further with you if you don't mind." And she laughed, her freckles dancing. "Mission. John, I'm already planning our next hike, but I warn you, I'm going to make you carry the backpack and the tent." And he laughed, for the first time in months without a shadow of pain, feeling that Emma's betrayal, her lies, her lovers, all this made him stronger, because he survived, endured, and now, with the city outside the window and Sarah opposite, he knew that this was not the end, but the beginning, and the final chord of his old life was played, leaving room for a new melody, full of hope. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.